name's Jenny. I'm here today to do my April wrap-up. It's interesting, I keep wanting to say March, even though March is very long gone. April has felt like a blur in a lot of ways, but I had a very, very successful reading month. So I'm really happy to talk to you about these books today. I had no less than 4 5-star reads in April, which I consider to be a huge success. I don't think I've ever given books 5 stars, that many books 5 stars in a month before. And I think perhaps it has to do with the variety of books I was reading and the fact that I was I did move very intuitively with my reading, especially at the beginning of the month. So March, the second to last or last weekend in March was book Hibernation, put on by Simon from Savage Reads, and I started 3 of my April reads on that weekend. And when I was picking my TBR for that, I was also obviously trying to pick from the books that I have on my shelf that I haven't read yet. And I also was trying to kind of help myself to lift my spirits, because obviously with everything that the world is going through, it was a really challenging time emotionally. I was trying to give myself something that would really take the edge off my emotional state. And so one of the things that I read that is really, really reassuring for me is poetry. And I have had this poetry collection for, I would say, at least 3 years. And I purchased this at the local consignment bookstore that we have. This is The Dwelling of Weather by Hilary. And this is a poetry collection that was published by an Ontario-based publisher in 2003. So this has sat on my shelf for a really long time. One of the prompts for Hibernation was a book you've been saving for a rainy day. And I believe I decided to choose this one since it has the clouds on the cover. It was actually raining that day, and I was craving some really amazing nature writing. And this book of poetry did not let me down. It is absolutely stunning. I was blown away by every poem. Hilary really draws on nature. So I would say every single poem in here is has nature references and brings nature to life. Especially because she grew up on the West Coast. She grew up here near where I live. She evokes a lot of imagery from this area, and she does it in a way that just sung to my heart and comforted me and inspired me. So as you can see, I've marked 7 or 8 poems in here with quotes, and those quotes inspired me to start a whole art project, which I have been doing since April 8th and which will go until May 31st. And this is all based on lilacs. I love lilacs. I have a lot of personal stories attached to them. They're really beautifully scented and stunning plant. And she mentioned lilacs so much in these poems that I just thought it would be amazing to do some sort of an art project celebrating them. And so if you go onto my Instagram, which is again in the description box below, into my stories highlights, you will be able to see all of the stories that I've posted so far. And I post to my stories, not every day, but several times a week, referencing lilacs. So whether it is the progression of the lilacs that I live beside as they are blooming, or quotes or poems related to lilacs, or I'm also putting some personal stories on there and sharing about them. If you're interested in such an art project, please check it out. And so that is, to me, the core of good poetry. It is when it inspires you, it fills you up, it makes you feel so alive and connected. And so I highly recommend this. I think she's an amazing poet. I'm also going to put in the description box links to her reading these some of the poems from this book, rather than read one myself, because I think that'll make this video get quite long. So if you're interested in hearing a couple of the poems, please check out those videos down below. On that same weekend, Hibernation weekend, I started my nonfiction read for one of my nonfiction reads for April, and that was A Woman's Touch, Kate Reid and Canada's Grand Hotels by Kate Armour Reid. So Kate Armour Reid is Kate Reid's granddaughter. And this woman was absolutely fascinating. She grew up, was born in Ontario. She was in New York visiting friends and met Grosvenor Lowry, who was the patent lawyer for Thomas Edison. And she met Thomas Edison as well. She was in society in New York, and so met a lot of important people in society at the time. She ended up marrying Grosvenor Lowry, who was very much her senior. So he was like 20 years at least older than her. And he already had 5 children from his previous wife. And she married him, had 2 more children with him, and they lived very happily together for about 10 years before he passed away. And then eventually she met someone else, someone from her past, romantic person from her past, and they got married, and they worked in Canada's grand hotels that were run by the Canadian Railway. And so she decorated these hotels. So she is pretty much, as far as anyone knows and the researcher was able to find in this book, the first interior decorator in Canada. And she had really good taste, and she didn't make her own money. Her husband made the money, and she did her work without getting paid for it. And so in terms of learning about Canada and learning about the history of interior decoration, learning about the history of these hotels being built. So these are the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, Banff Springs Hotel, the Empress in Victoria, BC, and several other ones across Canada along the railway line. It's very interesting. Her second husband was actually worked for the Canadian government and was part of the establishment of residential schools. And so the author really goes into, you know, how troubled he would have been if he would have known what was actually happening at those schools, because he apparently had much better intentions than that. But obviously a very complex issue. She touches on it here only to say that, you know, what as a period of history that he was working in, that was part of his contribution, but that it was now like a dark mark on Canadian history. He also was working in these hotels, and they lived in the hotels, and they moved, you know, it really spans a lot of time. We go through her sons fighting in World War I. She goes to England and lives in England when they are fighting to be near them. She was just a fascinating woman. And this just touched on so many parts of history that I didn't know about, and I really enjoyed this. It was a great read. Okay, and the other book left to talk about that I started during hibernation and finished early in the beginning of April is The Dark Dark by Samantha Hunt. This is the first short story collection that I have given 5 stars to. I liked every single story in this book. Samantha Hunt is a very interesting writer. She blends a lot of supernatural elements. I guess you call this magical realism in some stories, with this very grounded, earthy feel. So you're wrapped up in the story. You are taken on this magical ride. I loved her references. I loved her way of writing. It's very engrossing, and it really, really floored me at times. There is beautiful imagery in here, very lyrical. The stories were very varied, you know, from a woman who is turning into a deer at night, to a kind of cult of teenage girls who get pregnant together. There are stories about infertility. There's a story about a man who becomes obsessed with a mechanical woman. It's just, they were so interesting. So there's just so much to get out of these stories. And I had never even heard of Samantha Hunt. I got this book at a book exchange party at Christmas time. So it was like I emailed my coworker and thanked her so much for sharing this book, because I'm so thrilled that I found a book of short stories that I wanted to give 5 stars to. And it was, just an uplifting read. It just took me to different places and made me think about things in different lights. So really enjoyed this one. Okay, so on audio, I listened to Just Kids by Patti Smith, and this memoir is one that I have wanted to read for a really long time. And I wanted to read more nonfiction this month, because in June I will probably be judging the Booktube Prize nonfiction again, and so I'm trying to get my own personal nonfiction read when I can. Just Kids is the memoir of Patti Smith's relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe. They were both young, ambitious to a degree artists starting out in New York at the same time. They're the same age. And what I loved the most about this memoir is how it illustrates this incredible, inspirational artist-muse relationship that went back and forth between them. So Robert was her muse and she was Robert's muse, and they had a relationship that was very mature. They were in love with each other and had a physical relationship, but Robert began to understand that he was gay. And so as he was coming to terms with that, Patti was there, and she kind of helped but also supported him as a person as he was making this transition from being raised extremely religiously as a Catholic to accepting who he was as a gay man. And that relationship is very one that fascinates me. I also, similarly, I'm interested in the relationship between Dora Carrington and Linton Strachey, and they had a kind of a similar relationship, although Linton Strachey was not interested in Dora physically because he knew he was gay, but they still loved each other in this very intense way and were inspired by each other. And so that kind of relationship I find really fascinating, and I would like to read more about it in the future. But Patti Smith's writing, I mean, she's a poet, she's a songwriter, she just writes in this beautiful way. For a while I thought, oh my gosh, how could she possibly remember everything in so much detail? But then she mentions, like near the end of the book, that she stopped keeping a diary for the period of time she's mentioning, so she can't recall it with much detail. And I thought, oh, she must be one of those people that keeps really detailed diaries of her life, and she's been able to go back and look at them, and they've evoked those memories again so that she could share them so clearly. They had a really interesting life in New York, meeting lots of people in the poetry scene, the theater scene, and the music scene, and the art scene in New York at the time, in the late 60s and into the 70s. If you're not familiar with Robert Mapplethorpe as an artist, he had many mediums, but he was primarily a photographer near the end, and he took amazing photographs that were celebrating sexuality, and a very specific type of sexuality at the time in gay culture. And so he was very controversial, and his shows were often censored, and he had a lot of people that thought what he was doing was just outright pornography. But he took those ideas of pornography and was bringing them to an artistic level, or adding in a fine art perspective to them. So I don't think his artwork is for everybody, but he was a fascinating man, and he did die of complications of AIDS in the late 80s. And him and Patti Smith stayed in touch that entire time. And, you know, Patti went on to marry and have children and have a family. And Robert obviously went on to have other relationships, but they always loved each other, and they always kept each other in a very, very special place in their hearts. So if you're interested at all in, you know, listening to something with such depth about relationship, I would really highly recommend it. I actually listened to the audio version, like I said, and Patti Smith narrates it herself, so it's quite wonderful. I love the tone of her voice. So that was 5 stars as well. So I'll talk to you about my last 5-star read, which was my Aussie April read, which was Flames by Robbie Arnott. I think this book is a piece of the most unique storytelling I've read in a really long time. I don't really want to share a lot about the plot of this book because I think the briefness of the blurb on the back is just perfect. It doesn't reveal very much, and I don't remember when I've listened to reviews of this if I've heard many people explain the plot, and I don't think you should know very much about it before you read it. Definitely has magical realism, definitely has, to me, this kind of superhero feeling to it, but superheroes very much based in the rawness and the wildness of nature. And so if that kind of is interesting to you, superheroes, supervillains who come from nature, and it's all about nature, specifically Tasmania in Australia, then check out this book. I mean, I was blown away by it. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just kind of followed along on this ride, and I will definitely be rereading this in future because I think it has a lot of depth and richness that I'm really interested in going into again. And it's a shorter book, you know, it's 227 pages, so you can reread this really easily. I could have read it all in one weekend. I was reading this for Dewey's, but I didn't want to because I didn't want it to end, and I wanted to give it its space. Also, the imagery in this book, I was actually dreaming about, I'm trying to remember which section it is. All the chapters are named, like one is called Grass, Coal, Cake, Feather. Feather is the section that I ended up dreaming about one night because it is so intense, and it has so much kind of dark and intense imagery that it just stuck in my brain and kept going around and around throughout the night. I would actually say that these two books have a really similar feel. So if you liked this, you should read this. If you've read this, you should read this. These go really well together. They have similar themes where a lot of the intensity and drama comes from this deep connection to nature and the kind of wild aspects of humans. And so absolutely incredible. I can't say enough about this. I totally understand why Natalie from My Reading Days has this as her #1 Aussie read. It is intense. And I know Robbie Arnott has a new book that is coming out in June of 2020, or supposed to be, we'll see. And I'm really excited to read it because I don't know how he could top this, but like his world and the way he makes a world is so unique and so engrossing. So I would recommend that. Okay, this is already getting long. So the last 4 books that I read in April were all for the BookTube prize, so I cannot talk to you about them or my feelings about them, so I'll just briefly list what they were. I listened to Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout on audio. I read A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. I read The Nickel Boys by Colsen Whitehead. And I read Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. And so those are my BookTube prize reads. And I've been vlogging my experience of reading them the whole time. And so those will be released in June once the BookTube prize results for round 2 have been announced. So that was my reading for April, I feel absolutely thrilled that I had such great reading experiences, despite the fact that the world is topsy-turvy. I am so grateful for these books and the fact that they were able to transport me and give me these amazing experiences. It definitely felt kind of escapist, but also was so inspiring, especially with the example of the poetry collection, just giving me a chance to feel inspired and make some work and really become engrossed in nature, which is a healing thing for me. And so I'm very grateful for that. So I hope that you had a great reading month in April. And if you'd like to keep track of what I'm reading from week to week, I'm happy to have you friend me on Goodreads. All that information is also down in the description box. I also am going to link in the description box a podcast that my husband and I were on. It's called the Social Witnessing Podcast, and it's produced locally here in Vancouver. And it's basically interviewing people about what their experience during this quarantine and during social distancing is like and how they're coping. And so if you have any interest in listening to that, the link to that is down below. And so thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back again soon with another video.